Chad Kroeger, frontman of Nickelback. Now we all know how much his own band is loved around the rock community, but it is also no secret that he has done quite a bit of work for other acts as well, some of which I've already covered on my channel previously, like My Darkest Days. I'd say that the most notable example would be Fury of a Dead Man, as that's a group still going strong today. Even if their earlier work was often labeled as Nickelback Light, and their newer material has delved into full-on pop rock that I myself am not a fan of. But whatever the case, they are not the topic of today's video. Instead, I will be taking a look back at one of Chad Kroeger's other ventures, another Canadian band that he helped along with their career, but one that these days has mostly been forgotten, with their last release coming all the way back in 2009. I'm talking about Default. This story starts all the way back in 1999. Hailing from Vancouver, Canada, Default originated from a group called Shock the Day. Now, Nickelback frontman Chad Kroeger was already familiar with the band at the time, but after learning that they had recently acquired a talented new singer in Dallas Smith, and after being immediately impressed by his ability after hearing one of their demo tapes, he himself was on board to help move the project further along. Sometime later, the band morphed into Default, and because Chad hadn't yet founded his own production company 604 Records yet, he instead helped the group get a deal with the infamous TVT Records. And so, in October of 2001, with big help from Kroeger, who helped with both writing and production, Default released their debut album The Fallout, and with big help from its lead single, it went on to be a big success.
Well, this is not for real, afraid to feel. I just hit the floor, don't ask for more.
Said lead single was track 3, Wasting My Time. A typical 2000s post-grunge ballad, but a pretty damn good one at that. Sure, it falls in line with a lot of the other stuff that was coming out of the scene at the time, but it does what it sets out to do well, and Dallas Smith's vocal performance really helps bring extra life to the track. It topped the rock chart in Canada, alongside peaking at numbers 3 and 2 on the Billboard alternative and mainstream rock charts respectively, with it only being beaten out by Puddle of Mudd's Blurry on the latter. On top of all that, it also peaked at number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100, certainly no mean feat for a rock act just starting out. It's easy to see why this song was as big as it was, and it's essentially the primary reason for the success of The Fallout. Now, this is usually where I say something along the lines of, oh, but this album definitely had a lot more to it than just that. But well, we'll get to that in a little bit. First, the follow-up single, track 2, Deny. Now, this song goes into a bit of a different direction, being a straight up rocker. And if you were into sports at the time, then no doubt it's a track that you would hear in many sports arenas. It's honestly the perfect song for that kind of setting, with the chorus being filled to the brim with energy that hits the listener like a freight train. All of it coming after a slow, gradual build-up, which only makes the eventual kick all the more satisfying. Again, Dallas's singing is awesome on here, and I'm just going to already say that his vocal talent was always Default's best attribute, with this being one of the tracks really showcasing his vocal chops. It's definitely one of the band's most well-known songs, and one of my personal favorites from their catalog too. No matter how much time goes by, this track never fails to hype me up. It makes me feel like I could take the whole world on. Deny again also topped the Canadian rock chart, and though it did not have the same success on Billboard as Wasting My Time, it still charted very respectively, continuing the band's good momentum on rock radio. And additionally, it also appeared on the soundtrack for EA Sports NHL 2003. But now, the rest of the album, how do I put this? The Fallout is a bit of a catfish. It's basically a perfect example of what many consider to be one of the big drawbacks of the 2000s mainstream rock scene. That being bands putting out a memorable single or two, enticing people to go out and buy their record, which then turns out to be full of phoned-in filler alongside those singles. I swear, before starting work on this video, I can't remember the last time that I actually sat through this whole album cover to cover and did not just turn it off after the third song. The disc kicks off with all of its ammunition at the start, with the album opener Sick and Tired also being a very strong and underrated song, and honestly might even low-key be my favorite cut on the record. But then after we get through the singles in tracks 2 and 3, the album falls off a cliff in terms of quality and never recovers. I searched high and low, but genuinely couldn't find any other real notable highlights on this track list. Not even the other single, Live a Lie, which in my opinion is pretty subpar and underwhelming, like many of the other tracks on this release. And this is all coming from someone who loves just about anything that came out of the early 2000s post-grunge scene. I just can't stress enough how top-heavy this whole album is. Sure, none of it is ever bad, but it's just painfully unremarkable. It's one of those cases where the band name really describes the music well, as this is some of the most default early 2000s post-grunge that you could imagine, as harsh as that might sound. Still, it worked, and as I previously mentioned, thanks mostly to wasting my time, the Fallout went on to be certified platinum in the US, and it allowed the band to tour the world alongside Nickelback following its release. So yeah, these guys can forever say that their debut album went platinum, something not anyone can say, especially in the rock scene. And well, going forward, there was still hope that, considering the Fallout was only the band's first ever album, that they could iron out some of their imperfections and deliver a better, more well-rounded follow-up. Said follow-up would come in the shape of 2003's Elocation, an album which again had direct support from Chad Kroeger as he returned to assist with the writing and production. The lead single this time was Taking My Life Away, which, despite enjoying some respectable radio play, fell way short of what the band achieved on their debut, and the whole album would unfortunately follow in the same vein. What can I say? I was just never really able to get into this record at all. Again, it's a case of none of it really being bad, but rather forgettable. It's another default 2000s rock album, and outside of that, it simply doesn't do much for me, while also commercially paling in comparison with its predecessor. Why wasn't it as successful? Well, simple. It just didn't have that one big single, Wasting My Time. As I mentioned earlier, that song alone sold most of the copies of the Fallout, and without a big pull like that here, Elocation was almost doomed to disappoint. And this was a stumble that the outfit wouldn't really ever recover from commercially. They would still go on to enjoy some decent success on Canadian rock radio, but they would never manage to properly break through into the American market again, while at the same time, Chad Kroeger's Nickelback was still on top of the world and the charts. For me, Elocation is basically the Fallout but without the highlights, leaving us with a disc that's even less memorable and just sorta exists. Perhaps this is how people view all the other generally disliked music from the era that I happen to like. Who knows? And once more, the material here isn't bad, and if anyone is a fan of this album, then power to you, but for me, it's just unpleasantly average. At this point, we've fallen into a bit of a negative flow, and I wouldn't call you crazy for assuming that this momentum would only carry on going forward. However, on that note, we move on into Default's third studio album, 2005's One Thing Remains, a record which I personally consider to be very underrated. Sure, it isn't a work of art that reinvents the wheels of the genre, but it finally takes the sound that the band was aiming for and produces an all-around solid end product, more than solid even. We finally got a record that I can listen to front to back and enjoy myself all throughout. I guess 3 times really is the charm, huh? It's an album that I honestly still come back to, and I consider it to be one of the more underrated releases of the entire 2000s rock scene. Let me repeat myself, it's not some amazing misunderstood gem, but across the tracklist you'll find a bunch of memorable cuts. Looking at the singles, Count on Me is certainly one of the record's biggest highlights, being a catchy feel-good song about being there for someone you care about. It's a simple yet well executed message, and the track actually managed to get some mainstream rock radio play as well, though it charted the best in Canada. That last part can also be said for the next single, I Can't Win, which is a more upbeat rocker that dials up the energy and, while not being a masterpiece, succeeds in being a fun, energetic jam. The last single, The Way We Were, is less memorable and kinda reminds me of songs you'd find on the band's previous releases. It's still a decent enough slower tune, and luckily it's surrounded by stronger material. But what really makes this disc shine in comparison to its predecessors is its depth. No more catfishing to be found here, no. Instead, we get some deeper cuts that manage to outshine what was being pushed to the radio. The first track, All Is Forgiven, starts the album off very neatly, with a slightly unique structure. There is a contrast between verse and chorus, where it's the choruses that are more subtle and laid back, with Smith's vocals being accompanied by the clean strumming of a guitar and nothing more, while it's the verses where the drums and distorted guitars kick in. The track has this chill, nostalgic vibe to it, and I can't quite put it into words, but in any case, it is a great opener. Moving along, we get what I consider to be the best song on the album in track 3, It Only Hurts. I honestly don't for the life of me know why it wasn't a single, as it basically has all the ingredients for a 2000s rock radio hit. Now make of that what you will, but I simply love this track. It's beautifully put together, with the instrumentation perfectly complementing Dallas Smith's vocals, which as always are top notch. The way the mellower sections transition into the choruses on this song is just so effective, really amplifying the overall emotional impact as the pre-chorus gradually builds up into the energy of the hook, and each time that It Only Hurts line comes in, I'm feeling it to the max.
I know it only hurts when your eyes are open. Lies get tossed and truth is spoken.
The track has also got a bit of a special place in my heart due to it being a song that I would frequently listen to in one particularly relatable moment in time. And it's still a part of my sad love song rotations. Just a great cut all across the board. Furthermore, track 9, The Memory Will Never Die, is another particularly emotional ride that I have a lot of love for. It has this bittersweet, sentimental vibe to it, positively looking back at the time spent together with someone despite it all coming to an end, hence the title The Memory Will Never Die. It's strongly written and extremely emotional and genuine, despite being a bit more laid back. Now I will say that there are some somewhat duller moments here and there on One Thing Remains. It is not a perfect package, but overall, it is an album that really manages to hold its own and keeps the listener's attention all throughout. It is without a doubt the band's best release thus far. It's really a shame that despite it being some of the band's best ever work, it never got too much attention. I definitely recommend it to anyone that hasn't checked it out yet, as I'm convinced you'll find at least a couple of songs you'll enjoy. But whatever the case, we are not done yet, as there is still one more album to cover. After the implosion of TVT Records, which caused the band some difficulties with bringing out their fourth record, Default finally moved labels and put out what would prove to be their final ever release in 2009, Comes and Goes. Apart from being the group's last ever album, it is also their first and in turn only record to have no contributions from Chad Kroeger, whose own band had found itself in a completely different stratosphere from Default by this point. In terms of singles, Comes and Goes performed decently on Canadian rock radio, and overall, while again not being anything revolutionary, it picks off right where One Thing Remains left off, being another strong and underappreciated rock record, and my personal favorite release in the band's discography. It really is a solid batch of love rockers and heartbroken ballads, so let's go through some of the highlights. Turn It On is an awesome, energetic opener that's full of flair, starting the record off in very strong fashion. It never fails to get me energized. Meanwhile, track 3, Little Too Late, is a heartfelt and powerful ballad that I personally come back to a lot. It's a song that can definitely get stuck in your head if you find yourself in a relatable situation. Song 4, Goodbye, on the other hand, has attitude and is mega catchy, with a chorus that pumps me up every time I listen to it, and every time I can't help but sing or at least hum along.
Gasoline, there's no reason to fight. You know you may be right. You know you may be right. Tell yourself I never could lie.
It is easily one of the most underrated post-grunge tracks about a relationship gone sour that I've ever come across. The title track, Comes and Goes, is another noteworthy cut. It's another emotional ballad about the love of a girl and its tendency of, as the title suggests, coming and going before you know it, and how all that can affect the partner involved. But my favorite song on the album, and possibly my favorite default song period, has to be track 6, Hold On To You. It's such a genuine and wholesome track about being there for a loved one, helping them through whatever struggle they're going through, and that in their worst moments, you will be there for them.
I know you feel so far away from better days. As you look for a way out, I'll hold on to you.
It picks up energy at just the right moments, and the climactic chorus gives me goosebumps every time, with Smith's vocal performance, as always, being the icing on the cake. I could go on and on, but simply put, if you can get around to listening to it, this is a record that I definitely recommend to any fan of 2000s post-grunge. But of course, this was the final ever release from Default. There was no drama or anything like that, as the band members simply decided to move on to different things during the 2010s. What's worthy of mentioning though is that group frontman and the band's best asset throughout their whole run, in my opinion, Dallas Smith, went the Aaron Lewis route and pursued a solo career as a country artist after Default. This venture has actually brought him a lot of success in Canada, winning numerous awards and becoming a staple of the Canadian country scene, with a lot of his work being certified gold or even platinum there. And all of this under Chad Kroeger's very own 604 Records label, keeping the Smith and Kroeger connection alive to this day, which I think is pretty wholesome. Default would get back together around 2018 or so to do some reunion touring, which I thought was pretty nice to see at the time. However, as of today, Wikipedia lists them as inactive again, and it's safe to assume that the band is now a thing of the past. But to recap, Default were generally a pretty run-of-the-mill 2000s post-grunge outfit that were lucky enough to break through with their debut thanks to its big lead single. Afterwards, their international success lessened, but they remained ever prominent in Canada, something which carried over into Dallas's own solo career. In retrospect, I think it's understandable why they've gone on to be somewhat forgotten, but they did put out some solid enough material in their time, especially in the latter half of their run. And for anyone that's into 2000s mainstream rock, I can definitely recommend some of their later work to you if you have not listened to it yet. In any case, that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on Default and if you remember them at all. For now, my name is F.A.D. I'm gonna see you guys in my next video. Bye.